Hello. Hello, welcome to the third talk in the Symbolic Symposium. I'm Dr. Paul Moffett, and this talk is about Arthurian nationalism. There were some technical issues with the previous time slot, so I wasn't able to record it then, so this is a live version of this talk, not a pre-recording, but I am recording it this time so that people who I've had a few requests for people unable to make it at this time slot, and you can watch it later. I'll make it available to watch later. So I'm going to share my screen. I am talking about Arthurian nationalism. And there's a sense in which I'm going to start by acknowledging there's a sense in which this talk I'm doing a little bit of mental work to make this talk fit in with the theme. One of the places I want to begin is thinking about what even is an epic. When I was first planning for the Symbolic Symposium, I tweeted a question that got a lot of response, most of which was fascinating, some of which led directly to the talks during this symposium, and I asked something like, tell me about a text you would consider epic but that isn't Greek, Latin, Italian, French, German, or English. And a lot of the responses, there were a lot of fascinating responses, fascinating on their own right for their own reasons. But one of the strains of the responses was a lot of conversation about what exactly is an epic. You'll get more engagement with that question on Sunday in Rachel McVeigh's talk about Chinese epics, which I am really looking forward to. But on Twitter, some people argued that an epic has to be poetry, others that it didn't matter if it was poetry as long as it was long and substantial. Some people argued that an epic needs to be generally heroic in tone, or feature larger-than-life characters, or feature something supernatural. Some argued it has to be Greek. Others said, no, not at all. Can you have a short epic? Can you have a comic epic? Like, what are we even talking about when we talk about an epic? And I have a bit of a fixation, it's really a bad habit, I would say, of going back to etymology in questions like this. Really, I'm as motivated by my own curiosity and interest as I am by anything else, but I want to kind of give a caveat that etymology isn't destiny. Words change their meaning, not just their sounds, and the fact that a word comes from a specific source word that means a thing doesn't necessarily mean that have anything to do with what the word means now or with what it should mean now. Take the word thing, for example. It originally comes from an Old Norse word meaning a public assembly, analogous to like a city council meeting. But there is a lot of interest. I am very interested in where the words come from. Epic, it will not surprise you to hear, is a Greek word originally. Epos means a poetic story in verse in later Greek, but the first meaning is just a story. It is a story. Sometimes, especially in the earliest examples we know, it means a word or just something spoken. But most commonly, an epos is a story. And that, incidentally, is also the meaning of the word saga. Saga comes from the Old Norse. Like epic, it means story, or like epic, it means something said. Something you say is a saga. That's where the word say comes from in English, from the same root as the Norse word saga. So epic and saga are the same thing. They're both just stories. I think we can take from that an epic needs to be narrative, but that it doesn't really need to be poetry. We think of epics as poetry specifically because Homer is the kind of example of what an epic is for centuries. Anything that Europeans wanted to call an epic they were either implicitly or explicitly comparing, often explicitly comparing to Homer or to Virgil's Aeneid, which was itself self-consciously referring back to Homer. And I bring up saga because I've seen some argument about whether some text or other is an epic or a saga. And if applying the word epic to a story means making some kind of comparison to Homer, then applying the word saga means making some kind of comparison to the Icelandic sagas, most of which were written down in the 13th century. And if we want to split hairs on genre, we might say that sagas are written in prose, while epics are written in poetry. But you can tell already that I mostly want to ignore that distinction. Many scholars would say that Icelandic sagas tend to focus on families or dynasties, while epics are more focused on a single protagonist, and specifically a single protagonist linked to the foundation or fate of the nation. We say that an awful lot in epics, and sometimes it gets cited as one of the foundational definitions of what an epic is. And that, at last, is really what I'm driving at in this whole talk. I'm not sure that the distinction between saga and epic is as clear-cut as sometimes I've seen people argue it is, but I do think there's something worth thinking about in the idea of a national epic. Even early on, and more as time went on, Homer's epics, as we heard from Jacob yesterday, are very important to Greek identity and the sense of Greece as a nation. Virgil's Aeneid is deliberately, consciously, and explicitly a literary nation-building exercise. And as James told us just earlier today, the Georgian epics, even though they aren't set in Georgia, they are, especially the Knight in Panther Skin, they are connected to the sense of Georgia as a nation. In my description of this talk, I was a little sloppy about English and British. I said, what does King Arthur have to do with English identity or British identity? And people outside the British Isles, and I find especially people in North America, tend not to appreciate the difference, the sense to which British and English are very much not the same thing. In modern political terms, England is one of the 4 nations on this island of Great Britain. The island is Great Britain. There are other little islands all around it. Sometimes they get called the British Isles. Ireland does not like to be referred to as the British part of the British Isles. But the island of Great Britain is 4 kingdoms or nations. Up here we have Scotland. In the north, here in the west is Wales. On the island of Ireland, there's Northern Ireland here. And this part down in the south is England. Maybe we would call, like here at the very tip is Cornwall, which is not, in modern political terms, is not one of the kingdoms in the United Kingdom, but historically has been. And I draw this all out, the distinction between Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Cornwall, and England, to say that historically, all of Great Britain and the islands all around it, these little islands and the island of Ireland, are all historically populated by Celtic-speaking peoples. The language spoken we call part of the Celtic language group, and we can subdivide those languages further. The people down in the south spoke the Brittonic languages, and the Brittonic languages are the linguistic ancestors of Scots, Gaelic, Cornish, and Welsh. The people in the northeast up here spoke a language group called Pictish. We don't really know what language that is. There are many theories. It's not my area. I don't know. The people in the northwest spoke a language group called Gaelic. The Gaelic languages are the linguistic ancestors of Irish and Manx, which is the language spoken on the Isle of Man. And English is not a Celtic language. English is not a Celtic language like Welsh and Irish and Scots Gaelic are. It's a Germanic language. So the difference historically and linguistically between English and Welsh, between England and Wales, is bigger than the historical difference between Wales and Scotland, or Ireland and Scotland, or Ireland or Wales, or Ireland and Cornwall. Now, I'm being pretty perfunctory in all of this, and you may already know most of it, but let's shift on to King Arthur, and I'll start making some of my main points here. I want to think of an epic as a long, quasi-mythological, foundational, usually nationalistic story. And when I say usually nationalistic, I mean both that it's reflective and constitutive of the nation, that it's an imaginary collection, and the nation is an imaginary collection of people with a shared identity. And in that sense, the point of an epic is both to create a shared story, often a shared origin story, and also to create boundaries by which the nation can define itself through exclusion. And that, by the way, is why some people in English have always found Beowulf to be an uneasy or contentious example of an English epic. It's written in English, but it isn't about England or the English or English identity or England as a nation. It's hard to see it as any kind of proto-narrative or origin story for any kind of English identity. And that is also part, if you attended the talk on Georgian epics, that is one of the reasons why what James had to say about the Georgian epics was so extremely enticing to me and the things I'm interested in, because the Georgian epics seem also not to be constitutive of the nation in the story, and I hope to speak more to James about that. But I want to think of Arthurian literature in the context of a national epic. King Arthur is king in relation to whom a group of people define themselves and their mutual connection. Arthurian literature is nationalist in that the story of King Arthur is one of the defining narratives of a nation deployed purposefully for the mythologizing and creation of that nation. We see that, let me clear my annotations so I'm not writing all over it. We see that in the earliest mention of Arthur in literature, arguably the earliest. Iggorddin is a Welsh poem. It is probably from around 600 AD, although the only manuscript we have is written much later than that. So there is some debate about when exactly it is set. So if it is set when most people think it is, it's the earliest mention of Arthur. This text is written in Welsh. It is set in Scotland, what is now Scotland, and it is written in Old Welsh by a poet named Aneurin. I read a bit of Welsh, but I never have a reason to speak it, so my Welsh pronunciation is probably not good. But in this Iggorddin is a series of poetic elegies for warriors. So this warrior is great in this way, this warrior is great in that way, and they're all related to a particular battle. And in the very end of Iggorddin, there is this passage that talking about one of the warriors. He thrust beyond three turned most bold. He cut the top of my screen is cut off, and I can't read my very own slide. He cut down the center and far wing. It's not important. He proved worthy, leading noble men. He gave from this herd steeds for winter, blah, blah, blah. Here's the important part. Though he was not Arthur, he did all this great stuff, but he was no Arthur. He was still pretty good. Now, the context of this is the first reference of Arthur, and we don't know whether this is the same Arthur that you think of as King Arthur or not. We do know it's the earliest reference in literature that survives to anyone that we might consider possibly an Arthur. And I'm going to claim right now that Arthur is not a historical figure, That is, there isn't anyone in the history of, there isn't any human in history who really fits with the idea that we have now of who King Arthur is. But I will say there is, I won't just say it is true. There have been a lot of King Arthur stories over a lot of time. And this earliest King Arthur isn't English. He isn't in an English text. And he's a Welsh legendary figure. That is, he's someone that this Welsh poet expects his Welsh audience to recognize as a figure in Welsh legendary history. That in around 800, the Historia Britannorum, which means the history of the Britons, was written by Nennius. Nennius is a historian, and he is writing about events just within his lifetime, so within living memory, and events that we are pretty sure really happened, although not necessarily the way he describes them. And Nennius writes about, so here's Nennius, the Historia Britannorum. He writes about, in those times, the Saxons. This is all Latin, but here's the English. Here's the Latin. In those times, the Saxons, and we see Arthur's name, and we see Arthur's name a few times. Here's the English. At that time, the Saxons. Something. It doesn't matter for my point. Then Arthur. And Arthur carried the image of the Virgin Mary, and Mount Badon. There were 960 men from one charge by Arthur. The point here in Geoffrey of Monmouth is that Arthur fought against the Saxons. Arthur fought against the Saxons with the kings of Britain, but Arthur himself was a military commander. The point there is that Arthur is a Briton. That is to say, he's Celtic, not Germanic. That is to say, he's not English. He fights against and wins against the invading Saxons to protect Britain from Saxons. So King Arthur's first identity, again, early identity, is not English at all. Also, notice he's there along with the kings of Britain, but he himself was their military commander. Some people read that to say that Arthur is not a king in this version. I think it's a little ambiguous. I think it definitely does not say he is the king. I think there are ways to read it that maybe he's one of the kings, but their military commander. But it's certainly not clear that he is the king in this story. So the earliest Arthur mention is not the king. He's also not English. And Geoffrey of Monmouth writes, uses the Historia Britannorum by Nennius as a source, and writes a Historia Regum Britanniae. That means a history of the kings of Britain. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing just after the Norman conquest in the 1100s. He writes a history of the kings of Britain, and he includes Arthur among the historical kings of Britain. And he writes this history in part to create a national mythological history. So remember, remember Britain is the whole island. I forgot the point of this slide because I didn't put a note on it, but the Geoffrey of Monmouth is right about here. So remember, this is Wales. Geoffrey of Monmouth ostensibly is from Wales. He is writing in Latin about the kings of Britain. We don't know what of Monmouth means, whether that's where he was born or raised or stationed, or just he had an affinity for it. People claim of for lots of reasons, but this is Geoffrey of Monmouth. And Geoffrey of Monmouth writes a whole history of the kings of Britain. The thing I want to point out about that, he starts off his history of the kings of Britain talking about the Trojan War. After the Trojan War, Aeneas etc., sailed to Italy. And in Italy, he was the father of Ascanius, um, uh, and Ascanius has a son whose name is Brutus. So Brutus is the grandson of Aeneas, who fled from Troy at the end of the Trojan War. Geoffrey tells us that Brutus, after winning battles and losing battles and fighting, he determines to flee and go to where he's been told in a dream that there's an island that's going to be his, in a dream that goddess told him of. And the island was then called Albion, and it was home to none but a few giants. And at last, Brutus called the island after his own name, Britain, and his companions Britons. And Geoffrey of Monmouth tells us that's where the word Britain comes from. That's why it's called Britain. This is not true. This is not where the word Britain comes from, but this is a mythologizing story of where Britain comes from. And Geoffrey also tells us that from thence afterwards, the language of the nation, which at first bore the name of Trojan, or rough Greek, was called British. And so Geoffrey of Monmouth is saying the Celtic language is rough Greek. He's creating a connection between British, Celtic Britons, and Trojans, who are themselves, through Aeneas, connected to the Greeks. Through Virgil, that is, through the Aeneid, are connected to Greeks. Geoffrey of Monmouth, like Nennius, and who I talked about, and Bede, who I did not talk about, but tells a similar historical account to Nennius, although Arthur isn't mentioned in Bede. And Geoffrey, unlike Gildas or Aneurin, Gildas is one of the sources of Nennius. He also doesn't mention Arthur, but tells a similar story to what Nennius tells. But Geoffrey, like Nennius and Bede, but unlike Gildas or Aneurin, he's writing what he thinks of as history. Nennius and Bede claim that what they're writing is history. Gildas was writing what he thought of as a sermon, using historical examples to illustrate his point about that inviting the Saxons onto Britain turned out terribly, just like inviting temptation and sin into your life is a bad idea. And Aneurin is writing this elegy is not the same thing as history, like poems about individual warriors. That's not the same thing as history. Aneurin doesn't think of what he's writing as history, but Geoffrey of Monmouth does. And specifically, he's writing what he thinks of as national mythologizing history. He's telling this story. For Geoffrey, it is less important that his historical facts are accurate. Usually they aren't. And it is more important that his historical story creates a mythology or history for the nation that exists in the present. That is to say, Geoffrey of Monmouth is writing propaganda. And so that's how we account for this story about the Trojans and Aeneas. That's not just there by happenstance. He is connecting Britain to the legacy of Troy in a very similar way to what Virgil does in the Aeneid. If you're unfamiliar, Virgil connects Aeneas to Troy, and Aeneas ends the Aeneid by founding Rome. And so Virgil's rhetorical purpose there is to say, yeah, the Greeks are an ancient and great civilization, but actually Rome comes from Aeneas, who's from Troy, which is older than Greece. And Geoffrey of Monmouth is doing a very similar thing here. Britain also comes from Troy. Britain is older and has a lineage all the way back, is equal in dignity to Rome. That propaganda works, and we see in later in like the 14th century, the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight begins also with this mention of, this is in the original, but a mention of Aeneas, and over the French flood, Felix Brutus, over the French sea, Brutus fled and established Britain. That's how the Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a 14th century poem about King Arthur and about Gawain, it begins repeating this story that Geoffrey of Monmouth told about how Brutus founded Britain. And Gawain and the Green Knight also repeats this story about the giants. Here, when the Green Knight first appears, the narrator tells us, in truth, half a giant, I believe that he was. And the Green Knight in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, then, is tied by the reference to giants, is tied to the idea of the native inhabitants of the island before the Britons first colonized it. And in other ways throughout Gawain and the Green Knight, because he's green, he lives in what is now Wales, in what is the wilderness of the poet's imagination. He's connected to nature, and he's not like, he's an older nature spirit giant connected to the land directly, in ways that are very archetypical of like the native inhabitants of a place. And what we see happening in Gawain and the Green Knight is Arthur is ostensibly British in a Briton, a Celtic Briton, because he's descended from Brutus in Gawain and the Green Knight. But Gawain and the Green Knight is written in English, and Arthur is starting to be associated with English culture and English. So we're moving everything down the line. The story of the Britons who supplanted the original giant inhabitants is like laid right over the story of the English who supplanted the original Celtic inhabitants. And the Green Knight symbolically, the Green Knight is literally a giant inhabitant of the island, and he is symbolically a Celtic inhabitant of the island who lives in Wales and is pushed away by the English who invade and colonize. Back to Geoffrey. Geoffrey of Monmouth rhetorically situates the Britons in a glorious but now faded past. And he talks about, right at the end of Geoffrey of Monmouth, he talks about the overcome by barbarism. They're no longer Britons, but Welshmen. So the current people who are descended from the Britons are Welsh, which is not as, like, they're not Britons anymore. They're descended into barbarism. And he compares the Welsh, like he talks about the Saxons are better organized than the Welsh. That's why they come to dominate the island. And in his narrative, Arthur, when he is king of the Britons, defeats the Saxons, fights them back, protects Britain, keeps the Saxons at bay. When Arthur fades away and British glory fades away and they become merely Welsh, then the Saxons can't defeat the Britons under Arthur, but they can defeat the Welsh. There's like a hierarchy of nations here. A brief side note about Saxons and Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon is a term that is quite controversial in medieval English studies these days. It has been conclusively shown that Anglo-Saxon is not a term anyone used to describe themselves through even after what used to be called the Anglo-Saxon period. It's called that by people looking back, but even in the 1600s, it's pretty rare for people to talk about Anglo-Saxon. It's not until the 19th century that we really start using the word Anglo-Saxon, so it's not a historically accurate term. It's used like Anglo is an adjective, so it's used like Saxon describes all Germanic people, and there's the mainland Saxons, and there's the Anglo-Saxons. That's the Saxons who live in England. So it gets used, it's like the Germanic English people are Anglo-Saxons. In fact, there are 3 separate tribes, the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons, and there's no evidence that they kind of referred to themselves ever as Anglo-Saxons. And Anglo-Saxon has fallen out of favor not just because it's historically inaccurate, but also it has been co-opted by English white nationalists. Particularly, there's a kind of political movement in England of like Anglo-Saxon racial purity as being the like ideal state of England. And so there's like a lot of people, including me, are like, I don't want to keep using this inaccurate term that also makes white supremacists think that they have a point. Okay, back to Geoffrey again. Most of Geoffrey of Monmouth is about King Arthur. 6 of the 12 books are either directly about King Arthur or are about like King Arthur's father and leading directly to Arthur's life. So the history of the kings of Britain, he has other kings in that list. In fact, Geoffrey of Monmouth is the first source we have of the story of King Lear, if you know that Shakespeare play. But most of what he talks about is King Arthur, and he's the source of a lot of what we think about as central to the legend of King Arthur. In Geoffrey, for example, Merlin is a character who prophesies Arthur's birth, builds Stonehenge, uses magic to transform Arthur's father, Uther, so that Uther can conceive Arthur. He later advises Arthur. In Geoffrey, Arthur's nephew, Modred, no R in Geoffrey of Monmouth, but R later on. So Mordred is Modred. But Modred, not Arthur's son, but Arthur's nephew, usurps his crown, marries Arthur's wife Guinevere. All of that, as far as we know, has its origin in Geoffrey. And the other part of Arthurian tradition that really begins with Geoffrey is a part we might not associate as strongly with King Arthur anymore today, but was definitely a major part of the conception of Arthur throughout the Middle Ages, which is Arthur as a conqueror. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthur conquers Gaul and then Rome before he has to return to fight Modred in his own country. And both parts of that, the historical justification of English conquest and the way that Geoffrey describes Arthur coming back from France, specifically from Normandy, to invade the island in order to reestablish his legitimate rule, those both have mythological nation-building impact. Arthur coming back from France to reestablish his rightful rule and also leaving behind a legacy in continental Europe, those both justify the Norman conquest of England, which happens in just before Geoffrey of Monmouth's lifetime. So it's in living memory of some of Geoffrey's audience, certainly. And that's where Geoffrey of Monmouth can be sympathetic to the Celts, not overly sympathetic to the Saxons, because Geoffrey actually thinks of himself as an English Norman, an Anglo-Norman, and his story is like the British long ago. Then there's the Saxons, then there's the Normans come in and kind of reestablish England as it should be. There is a whole history of Arthurian romances in French that I am going to skip here, but are nevertheless fascinating. And in any case, it is Geoffrey's description of Arthur's war in Rome is a direct source of a poet writing in French named Wace, who writes what we could think of as a further romanticization and fictionalization of Geoffrey. It's called the Roman de Brut. It's written in Old French. Wace is a direct source of an alliterative poem by an English priest called Layamon, which we usually call the Brut. Layamon's Brut was certainly a direct source for the alliterative Mort Arthur, anonymous, and the alliterative Mort Arthur was a direct source for Sir Thomas Malory's Le Mort d'Arthur. Did you follow that? It's okay if you didn't, because the point is, I don't really care if you can connect the dots as long as I show you that they can be connected. Because Le Mort d'Arthur is, of all of this so far, the text that I think we can make a real claim for being an epic. It's not in verse, but it is a mythologizing national story that comes from a historical tradition, that is Geoffrey of Monmouth, but is not really or even attempting to be direct history anymore in a way that really resonates with the way that epic interacts with history. I mentioned a French romance tradition a few minutes ago, and if you think of the pseudo-history, the chronicle tradition, and the romance as basically splitting with Wace, Le Mort d'Arthur brings them back together again. And scholars have argued and split hairs an awful lot on whether Le Mort d'Arthur is more like chronicle. There's several romances, the romance tradition. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to show you there are a lot of them. The question is Le Morte d'Arthur more chronicle or more romance? And I would argue that by taking the chronicle elements, the political national importance, and the romance elements, or the mythological and legendary emphasis with single protagonists whose stories are ongoing, it makes Le Morte d'Arthur really fit in with conversations about epic. William Caxton, the first, Michael Bakhtin writes about epic, and one of the things he writes about epic, he's a literary scholar and literary theorist from the early 20th century who had a huge impact on our conception of epic and conception of the novel. So he's writing especially about the novel as a literary form and contrasting it with the epic when he says that the epic lacks any relativity, any gradual, purely temporal progressions that might connect it with the present. It's walled off absolutely from all subsequent times, and above all from all those times in which the singer and his listeners are located. Bakhtin mostly is talking about epics to contrast them with novels. But what he says about epic and how it's walled off, there's like epic time, is different from modern time. That really resonates with the way time works in Le Morte d'Arthur in a different way from how it works in Geoffrey of Monmouth. Le Morte d'Arthur is the story of King Arthur and these early these adventures in early England and Britain, and it's kind of this walled off mythological time, whereas Geoffrey of Monmouth is drawing the line and connecting us all the way to the present. That's one of the things that makes Le Morte d'Arthur feel more epic. So Le Morte d'Arthur is the story of the life of King Arthur. Begins before Arthur is born and ends after he dies. And the first print edition of Le Morte d'Arthur is printed by English printer William Caxton. That first print edition is the only version of Le Morte d'Arthur anyone knew until the 1950s, which is a story for another time. But in the preface to that, William Caxton writes that he views Arthur, and more specifically Le Morte d'Arthur, as a nation-building and nation-defining mythological text. He tells a story in the prologue to his edition that many noble and diverse gentlemen of this realm of England came and demanded him many and often times, wherefore he have not do made and in print the noble history of the Saint Grail and the most renowned Christian king, first and chief of the three best Christian and worthy, King Arthur, which ought most to be remembered among us Englishmen before all other Christian kings. And the part I really want to emphasize here is Englishmen. Arthur ought to be remembered among Englishmen before all other Christian kings because Arthur is the greatest English king. Firstly, his inspiration is more relevant to English people than to other people, but secondly, that the opposite. No Christian king's memory is more important to English people than King Arthur's memory, because he's the English king of England. The appeal to Caxton's readers as Englishmen is an appeal to common identity grounded in a common language and geography. And this is where, like, Arthur may be connected to Celts and Britons in the past, but he stands for Englishness in Caxton's imagination. He's one of the three best Christian and worthy, so Arthur, in Caxton's conception, he's also there's also possibly a religious valence to that. In Caxton's conception, King Arthur is a nation-building and nationalistic figure. And Caxton writes there are many volumes about Arthur and his knights in French and in Welsh. The Welsh is the Godwin that I talked about, and also the Mabinogion, which I have not talked about, but is a collection of stories in Welsh about King Arthur. And the French is all those French romances I talked about, waste, but also the romances were extremely popular in French. But Caxton says there's Welsh and there's French, but there's no English, and there should be, because he's an English king. He should be written about in English for Englishmen. The alliterative Mort Arthur is one of the sources of Le Morte d'Arthur as written by Thomas Malory that we were just talking about. I know it's confusing because they have almost the same name. But in the alliterative Mort Arthur, we have a whole story of Arthur conquering Rome, and that story ends up in Le Morte d'Arthur also. It's one of the things that Malory uses Le Morte d'Arthur as a source. And that story employs Arthurian legend in the service of a story where Arthur engages in a war of conquest on behalf of his kingdom. It has political significance in its own time, but because it's about national supremacy within Christendom. It's a Christian the England of the alliterative Morte d'Arthur and Le Morte d'Arthur by Malory is a Christian nation which justly conquers another Christian nation because of the manifest supremacy of its king and by association all its people. And there's references in the alliterative Morte d'Arthur, especially there's references to crusade. Mostly that's downplayed in Malory, and it's mostly just about a Christian nation that is superior because its king is superior. In an arguably more benign, I have examples, I'm not going to waste time on them actually, but in an arguably more benign context, the myth of the Fisher King, or the maimed king, or the wounded king, those are all the same character. This is a character in Arthurian legend of a king who is wounded, and when he is wounded, the whole country around him suffers. The Fisher King is not King Arthur. In Malory, he's King Pelham. He usually has names similar to that. And in Malory, a knight, Balin, strikes the Fisher King, and when he's wounded, the whole castle falls down, and all the country and cities all around, people die, and the whole nation suffers. The idea behind that is that the nation is defined by the king, and the king's fitness or health or goodness or spiritual health leads directly to the fitness or health or spiritual health of the nation. So stories about King Arthur, stories about King Arthur's knights are by metonymy stories about King Arthur, and stories about King Arthur are stories about the entire nation. Stories about England or Britain or Wales or Logres or whatever nation the storyteller happens to be talking about in that version. So in other words, there's an investment in the idea of the other throughout Arthurian literature, because nations are defined by their boundaries, both literal and symbolic, and Arthur can only have a kingdom if we know where the boundaries are. Not only geographical, but also ideological, moral, spiritual. At the end of Le Morte d'Arthur, this part here, all this part is written by Malory as himself, no longer telling the story, but talking about the writing of the story. So that's all fascinating, and I talk about it lots in other contexts. But for today, it's not the real end of the story proper. The end of the story proper is just before that. Here, as the French book says, Sir Bors, Sir Ector, Sir Blamor, and Sir Blueberries went into the Holy Land, and there they did many battles upon the miscreants or Turks. That phrase there, miscreants or Turks, is important. We should not read miscreants the way that we would read miscreants in modern English. It literally means like miscreant, the creant, like a creed. So they have misbelievers. They believe the wrong thing. In other words, Turks and miscreants are Muslims. So people who aren't Christian, they believe wrong. They're in the Holy Land and they believe the wrong thing. They are Muslims. And there's a conflation here of Muslims and Turks generally. There's the only use of Turk in Malory, and it kind of conflates Turks and miscreants in a very similar way to the way 21st century and 20th century people sometimes conflate Arabic and Islamic identities. So the religious differences are coded ethnically and vice versa. Common medieval term for this conflated religious, ethnic, racial, Islamic, Arabic identity is Saracen. And Malory has a character who is a Saracen, Palomedes the Saracen, who is a major character throughout Le Morte d'Arthur, and part of what he is doing there is defining the Fellowship of Arthur by exclusion. He's always a little bit liminal. He's always a little bit on the borders or outside Le Morte d'Arthur. One of his main purposes is he is a rival and contrast to Sir Tristram. He is also in love with Isolde. Tristram and Isolde is one of the famous love stories of Le Morte d'Arthur. And Palomedes is never a serious rival for Isolde's affection. He's never an equal rival for Tristram because he's on the outside. And part of the effect of him being on the outside is it makes Tristram a little more on the inside. Because Tristram himself is also an outsider. He is a member of the Cornish court, not a member of Arthur's court. And we see there's a lot of little comments throughout the Sir Tristram stories about it is seldom seen that ye Cornish knights be valiant men in arms. Or here, I wist never, I knew never a good knight come out of Cornwall, unless it was Sir Tristram de Lyonesse. So Cornish knights are no good, except for Tristram. And people keep not, throughout his story, it's quite funny, people keep not recognizing Tristram and saying, like, you must be no good because you're Cornish, and then he will defeat them. And they're like, oh no, turns out you were the one good Cornish knight. But the point is, Palomedes exists to make Tristram comparatively an insider, and Tristram exists to make other knights comparatively an insider, which leads to the question, like, who is in? If Palomedes is outsider and Tristram is an outsider, who is in? And the answer is Englishman. Malory, at one of the critical points in the story, when Arthur returns to fight against Mordred, and the people all have turned and supported Mordred instead of Arthur, even though Arthur is the greatest king, Malory says, "Lo, all ye Englishmen, do you see what a mischief there was?" And I really want to point out this part that he says, "You Englishmen, notice that these Englishmen did this thing, and it's what we Englishmen often are like." So you, my audience, are Englishmen. These, my characters, are Englishmen. I am also an Englishman. We are all connected by being Englishmen. That is who is in this story. So what does this all mean? There was meant to be a slide there. What does it all mean? It means, I would say, that Arthurian literature, like a lot of epic literature, has a nationalistic vein, and that nationalistic vein can be exploited even in the 21st century. We see white supremacists, especially in the United States and England, using King Arthur and Arthurian imagery to justify white supremacy. And some medievalists have argued, in fact, I presented something like this as I submitted something like this as an article and got back some criticism that there's nothing inherent in Arthurian literature that's nationalistic. It's just arbitrary. And I would say, no, it is not arbitrary. There are nationalistic things in Arthurian literature, as in national epic in general, that can be deployed by 21st century nationalists. And what does that mean for us reading it if you, like me, don't share white nationalist sympathies and think that's a bad thing? Well, we can recognize that the nation is imaginary. The nation is mythological and imaginary, and the nationalism that Arthurian literature points to is also imaginary and fictional and always shifting. And so, if King Arthur represents some nationalist identity, what the nation is that he represents is not consistent, is not coherent, keeps shifting. And when we recognize that, we can, as scholars, as readers, as individuals, we can recognize that nationalism reaches for a fictional, mythological reality that is itself contingent, and we can create our own. We as all people can argue over what that national identity is and what it means. And those who, like me, think that white nationalism and racist nationalist ideologies are evil, are justified in the history of the text and then the mythologies that are employed by white nationalists to argue exactly against them, because the nationalist identity is so shifting. Are there any questions? I will open for questions from anyone if there are any. I'm going to stop recording now.